السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. أما بعد. Brothers and sisters, welcome to our program Islamic Wills, where we learn how to structure and to learn the importance of what Islamic will is from the Quran and the Sunnah, and of course to the state law as well. I'm alhamdulillah excited. I have a dear friend of mine who is joining us. We had done this previously, I think almost a year ago, because of the importance of this topic. But there's Zohaib Mustafa, who is an attorney, joining us, who will be covering major portion of our session tonight, inshallah. So without a further ado, I'll have Brother Zohaib join us. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well also. Just to go back on what you were saying, I think it's exactly been 1 year next month that we did this program.
Wow.
A lot has definitely changed. A lot of people have reached out in order to get this, a will made or something to that effect for their planning. And I think it's been a difficult year. And I'm excited to be back here again. Jazakallah khair for the offer to you and ICLI as well.
Alhamdulillah, it is great. I know we have an amazing presentation yourself, mashallah, that you have prepared, work, mashallah. Just before we get to the details of it, Brother Zohaib, if I may ask you a few just simple questions, inshallah. What is an, I'll touch upon the Islamic portion as well, but what is an Islamic will? What is it? What makes it different from everything else? And what is the main purpose of an Islamic will that you as an attorney get to speak to clients about?
I'll just keep it very short and sweet. An Islamic will is that we are following the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Normally, when you make a will, you make a trust, you do other end-of-life decisions. You do it at your own free will. You say XYZ will get this portion. XYZ will get this portion. But we are completely negating that. We are saying that it's not our free will to give this person this amount, but we are following the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He has ordained to us that this person should get this percentage. So in short, that's what an Islamic will is, versus something that you would make on your own, and you would, cite what distributions you would want to give to the person.
That is amazing. Thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions that's going to come in during the course of our talk. Shall we proceed towards our presentation, Brother Zohaib?
I'm ready to hit the ground running. I think we can definitely go.
Let's do it, inshallah. All right, Bismillah.
Just a brief intro. We will, inshallah, be talking about Islamic wills. We have Mufti Farhan and myself. So every seminar that we take, every webinar we attend, every lecture that we go to, every meeting that we attend at work, whether it's in our personal lives as well, there are some objectives to it. And the objectives should always be that we gain knowledge from it, but then we also have to implement that knowledge. Gaining knowledge, it's very easy to do nowadays. You can listen to podcasts, you could listen to YouTube videos, you could attend this seminar, which you brothers and sisters are here doing now. But after that, we have to follow through that. How are we going to implement this knowledge in our lives? And I think that's the part, myself speaking first, that we sometimes forget. The agenda for tonight is that we will be speaking about health proxies, living wills, power of attorneys, and then we will touch on Islamic wills, distributions, and if they're compatible with New York State or not. As a standard legal disclaimer, none of this is legal advice. It does not constitute any attorney-client privilege. This is just strictly for educational or informational purposes, and please only use it in regards to that.
And Brother Zohaib, I so need that for my fatwas as well.
I think I can get away with it, but not you.
Sometimes when I talk, I remember the words of my teacher. They say that as a scholar, as a mufti, you are raqim min Allah. You're signing on behalf of the commands of Allah. Your one yes and one no can change everything. And not only this, but our akhirah depends upon what we say, So I think that's an excellent disclaimer for myself to always remember and have that. But we'll speak about that on a separate note, inshallah. Please.
Yeah, definitely. And I think most fatwas end with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So I guess, New York State law knows best. So some end-of-life considerations aside from a will and a trust, which we will talk about a little bit later, is purchasing a funeral plot. Now, obviously, nobody knows where they're going to pass away, but sometimes this is something that individuals engage in when thinking about end-of-life considerations. Putting money aside for funeral expenses. In my local masajid, I'll never forget something that really touched me is one of the brothers had put money aside so it would not be a burden on his family when he passed away. Because passing away also, minimum in New York State, I think you're looking at anywhere from $35 to maybe $6,000 for a burial process from beginning until end. And that can be very expensive. And in some cases, it could also be a financial burden on the family. So putting money aside from that is extremely important. Health proxy, we will touch on that just shortly. Durable power of attorney is something we will also speak on in detail, as well as a living will. Now, let's first touch on a healthcare proxy. Just some interesting facts and cases that I throw in throughout this presentation, not that it's relevant to New York or even relevant now because so much time has passed, but there was a case in Florida with a lady named Terry Chavau. In the 1990s, she just collapsed in her kitchen. And she collapsed, and basically she was in an incapacitated state. She was later declared to be in a vegetated state. She had no movement whatsoever due to so much loss of oxygen in her brain. For 15 years, and I say that again, for 15 years, from 1990 until 2005, her parents and her husband fought through the legal system to decide what would happen to her. Whether she would be taken off her feeding tube and her oxygen would be cut, or is it something that would be kept onto her in hopes that she would one day come back to a capacitated state? It never happened. Eventually, a court ordered that she should be taken off her oxygen and her feeding tube, and she was declared dead in 2005. But 15 years, and a health proxy could have really changed that. Again, this is not the norm. Things have changed drastically since then, especially New York State laws, but just something for us to think about. Now, why do we need a healthcare proxy? We need a healthcare proxy because, God forbid, we're in an incapacitated state, we're in a coma, we're in a vegetated state. We want someone that knows what our wishes are to make decisions for us as to how long we should be on those things. Now, what if I don't have one? I can't speak for every state, but in New York State, they appoint something called surrogates. And there's basically a chain of individuals they go through to make decisions for you. At the very top of that list is your spouse or your significant other. Below that are children over the age of 18. Below that are parents. Now, where you sometimes get conflict is let's say there's no spouse and you have children over the age of 18. Now, the two children disagree about what should happen. Now, if you go one below that, the parents disagree as to what should happen. Now, this is where conflict arises. And at such a sensitive stage, you don't want there to be conflict. So that's why it's better to have a healthcare proxy. Who should you appoint? Who should you appoint and what should be discussed with the agent? I guess they kind of go in tandem. And that's basically what your end-of-life decisions are. Do you want to be resuscitated? Do you not want to be resuscitated? How long would you like to be on a feeding tube? Things of that nature. These are all topics that are very, very difficult to discuss, but it's something that, we may face one day, and it's better to discuss it while we're in good health, as opposed to leaving it to our family members who may enter into conflict making those decisions.
So, Zohaib, if I may stop you for a second,
sure.
The health proxy is actually a part of the Islamic will itself. So when we prepare an entire Islamic will document, is health proxy an extra part of it, or comes as it, or is it something that people choose or do not choose?
Yeah. So typically speaking, well, I guess to answer your question straightforward, no, it is not a part of a regular will or an Islamic will. These are all additional documents to a will that one is suggested to have when they make their end of life decisions. So a will is something separate. A living will, which we will touch on next, is something separate.
Okay.
A healthcare proxy is something completely separate, and a power of attorney is also separate.
Got it. Sure, that makes sense. So a lot of time when people go and get admitted to hospitals, they have you sign a health proxy. Is that something similar to what we're talking about, or this
Correct.
is
correct? It's similar, and it's better to do it while you're in good health, because you don't know what type of condition you're going to enter into the hospital, and then you may leave it for a conflict to arise depending on who makes that decision and what their views are.
So a person who is normal, perfectly fine, perfect health condition can also appoint someone that they feel will be responsible for them as a health proxy.
Correct. And I think everyone would recommend to do it while you're in good health, because when you're incapacitated, you don't have the ability to make these decisions. And that's where you get judicial intervention or other things that you could have saved a bunch of money and time by doing it earlier in your life.
Got it.
Mufti Farhan, I guess one question for you, which is always a difficult question, because, and I've heard this analogy and I really like it, because, as Muslims, we cannot eat pork, something forbidden for us. But if we are starving and we are close to death, it's something that we are able to eat. A lot of people use that analogy when speaking about organs, right? And I guess it's a difficult conversation to have, that, if somebody can make use of my organs when I'm about to pass away and it could save their life, is it something permissible or something that's not advisable? And if you could maybe share some other end-of-life decisions that you may have come across, some calls that you received about family members seeking guidance.
Zohaib, actually, this was a fatwa that I wrote, I think, in the afternoon today. I wrote a couple of pages fatwa on the topic of organ transplant today.
I had no idea, as a disclaimer.
I know. So I wrote it in the afternoon. Inshallah, I'm going to try to make that public on our website so people can really go through it. It's actually a 13-page detailed document that one of my good friends, Mufti Muhammad ibn Adam, actually wrote, and then I took experts from it and then shared it with the people who have asked. But subhanAllah, it's a very complicated and very difficult topic, and I think it requires an entire session to itself. Because there is two large groups of individuals, one of them who say that, as you mentioned, that if you are in a state where you have to save a human life, you can take resort to even partaking of haram and things that are not permissible just because of the respect and dignity of a human being, meaning you save their life.
Correct.
But the other scholars are of the opinion that even if you go in a scenario or a situation where there are two individuals and one person passes away, in no Islamic ruling or no ethical process is it acceptable for one person to eat the meat of another person, human being, to survive. You can eat pork to save your life, but you can't do that. So there's a huge debate in regards to that. So, but definitely we touch upon that. But the topic that you said was one of the most difficult questions that I personally feel that I get. I got a call from South NASA Hospital yesterday. Son-in-law standing next to the bed of the relative, asking that if they can pull the plug and end the life, and this is one of the most difficult times and situations that as scholars we go through, with consulting not only with family members but with physicians, with people, with finding out the details of patients, and it's been so subhanAllah common in the past 1 year that it had never been. But subhanAllah, these are important topics that inshallah we'll definitely try to cover some other time.
Definitely. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch up on it a little bit, but definitely I think it's a topic to have in itself.
That's an amazing idea.
So living will versus the healthcare proxy. A lot of times when people hear the word living will, they think about, oh, this is my last will and testament. So last will and testament is one thing. A living will is something completely separate. Living will, in very short, states that these are, a living will, in short, basically says that I want these to be my end-of-life decisions. Instead of a healthcare proxy picking for me, I do not want to be resuscitated should my heart stop. If I'm in a vegetated state for XYZ time period and doctors decide, two physicians decide that it's irreversible, I would like to be taken off my oxygen and any feeding tubes that I'm on. So basically, while you're alive and in good health, you're making these advanced healthcare decisions for yourself versus a healthcare proxy where you're assigning somebody to make the decision for you when you are not able to make those decisions for yourself. Now, power of attorney. This is something a lot of people don't take seriously, but it can come in extraordinary use should your situation require it. Basically, in short, you're assigning, you as a principal are assigning your power in certain matters to an agent to act on your behalf in certain situations. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're purchasing a property and you can't be there, or you're selling a property and you can't be there, or you want to make some banking or financial decisions, and for one reason or the other, you are not available. Or you want to start some court proceeding and you are not there. So, or an estate matter or things of that nature. So this is more of a financial sense of decisions. You're appointing somebody else to make on your behalf. And it has nothing to do with health. So they are not making, a lot of times people call me and they're like, I want a power of attorney. And I ask, why do you need a power of attorney? Because I want to make healthcare decisions for my parents. That would be a health proxy. But a power of attorney, think of it more in the financial sense, that you're appointing somebody to make decisions for you. Obviously, yes.
Sorry to cut you up. Can a power of attorney make a health proxy decision on your behalf as well, or no?
No, that would be strictly for your healthcare proxy to make.
Got it.
Perfect. So yeah, the best way to separate the two is think of healthcare proxy as solely making healthcare decisions, and power of attorney making other decisions that you check off that you want that individual person to make. I do real estate transactions. So when sometimes the seller or the buyer is not able to show because they're out of state or they're out of country, we obtain a power of attorney on their behalf to execute XYZ documents because they're not there. Power of attorney expires when the person passes away. So a power of attorney is no longer valuable to the agent if the person passes away. However, if the person is incapacitated, you could still make decisions for them. And I'll give you a perfect example, and we'll move on from this after this. I had an individual call me. His dad was dealing with dementia. His dad owned a property under his name. He wanted to sell it. He can't sell it because he wouldn't be able, that father wouldn't be able to sign the power of attorney because he currently has dementia. But had his father signed it prior to that, his son would have been able to make decisions for him pertaining to real estate. Now what his son has to do is go through a court process and obtain guardianship over his parents' property, and then he could sell it or do other things with it. But executing a power of attorney while you're in good health definitely saves you a lot of trouble.
Great.
So let's talk a little bit about Islamic Will's vocab. So living will, healthcare proxy, we touched on. Last will and testament is your last will, is what you leave behind, which governs, how your estate should be distributed. Wasiya, sometimes individuals refer to it as Islamic will. That may be the case, but it is specifically for a certain part in the Islamic will, which we will touch on in a little bit. Testator is the person signing the will and making the will. The executor is a person you sign to administer your estate and distribute your assets. Estate is everything you leave behind, right? And we'll touch more on that a little bit later. A trustee is somebody who administers your estate in a trust. A beneficiary is somebody who inherits from a will. And witnesses are individuals who see you sign the will. And intestacy is a person who passes, dying in a state of intestacy is somebody who passed away without a will. It's more so New York State terminology. Now, goal of estate planning. Why do we need to estate plan? We want to control property while we are alive and well. Take care of ourselves if we become disabled. Take care of loved ones once we pass away. And the end goal is to save every tax dollar, professional fee, meaning not paying people like me, your time, your court cost, legally possible to you. Basis of wasiya and inheritance. Where is it?
I'm sorry. I'm going to stop you for 1 second. Brother Hamza had an interesting question that touches very close to what we just mentioned. Brother Hamza Kamisa writes and says, Assalamu alaikum, I have 2 questions. If you don't own property but have a significant amount of cash, should you make a will? Why should someone make a will if the state will give the person's wealth to the family anyway? I'm 100% for wills, but I've always had these questions.
I'm just going to read if you can bring the question up one more time, Mufti Farhan.
Yes.
I'm just quickly glancing at it.
Yeah, please, go ahead. Please do the read.
Okay, no, I understand this question. So there's a few different parts in there. First thing is, if we're talking about specifically, and I don't want to jump ahead because we will cover this later on, so I'll just keep it short. Where the question was, to paraphrase, no property, only leaving behind cash. Why should we make a will if the state will still give away the cash? The whole, the premise of that question and the purpose of this is that the way the state will give it away is not according to Islamic principles. So that's how we would want a will to decide how that money should be distributed. Because if there's no Islamic will in place, the percentages are completely different than what New York State has, as opposed to what Islamic inheritance is.
I was just going to mention, thank you so much. I was just going to say that the wealth definitely will be distributed, but will it be distributed how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us? Because our mal, our life, and everything is amanat and trust to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Definitely. Great question though.
Easy question.
So basis of wasiya and inheritance, Quran and Hadith, where does this come from? And this is an area Mufti Farhan specializes in, so I will let him take it from there.
So, subhanAllah, when we look at the Quran itself, brothers and sisters, the Quran itself is a book of guidance, hudal linnas, till the day of Qiyamah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made for us, subhanAllah, the Quran as a guide, as a pathway towards, guidance. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Nisa, chapter 4, verse number 11, with regards to yusikumullahu fi awladikum, the distribution of the wealth, because as I mentioned previously, and Brother Zohaib also mentioned, that even our mal and our wealth all are amanat and trust from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And amongst the questions that we will be questioned on the day of Qiyamah, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ said that no person will be able to move on the day of Qiyamah till they answer a few questions. How did you live your life? How did you live your life when you were young? How did you earn your wealth? How did you spend your wealth? And how much did you practice upon the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you? So we will be questioned for this, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to us in these verses of the Quran in Surah Nisa, verse number 11, the next tab, verse number 12. Then we get to, Surah Nisa, verse number 176. All of these verses of the Quran are talking about the portions of how wealth should be separated. Because, brothers and sisters, the mal and wealth itself is a huge amanat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if it's not set properly, it could become a huge fitna and trial. And brothers and sisters, in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, when fatuhat and victory began to happen, and 22 provinces in Islam and 2.2 square million miles of area entered into the fold of Islam, and treasures began to gather in Medina, Umar radiallahu anhu looked at this wealth and he began to cry. And the Sahaba said, this is futuhat, this is a time of victory, you should be happy. He said that I've heard Rasulullah ﷺ saying, and he held the gold and silver in his hand, that this mal and this wealth will become a means of fight between two brothers and make them enemies. Meaning this is what mal is, wealth is. If it was for any khair, if any benefit, then the streets of Medina would have been filled with this at the time of Rasulullah ﷺ. I'm not saying having wealth is bad. Alhamdulillah, it's a blessing of Allah, and we should be fortunate. We should be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He has kept us in the state. But if we don't take care of this mal, it could become a fitna and a trial for us. That's why it's important for us to have that set guidelines in our life. And even inshallah, when we leave, our wealth is spent properly, inshallah. Back to you, Brother Zohaib, inshallah.
So my favorite slide, controversial alert. Surah Al-Nisa literally translates to the woman. Mufti Farhan, do you want to touch upon that a little bit?
The word the woman itself, subhanallah, my topic this Jummah itself, because of the Women History Month itself, was the sense of honor and dignity that Islam and our deen has given for women. As I mentioned in the khutbah, that the first person to accept Islam, the first person to give their life, the person who loved the Prophet the most, the one that the Prophet ﷺ loved the most, were all women of different types in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, which shows, and even the surah itself shows the importance that in societies prior to even Islam and even till current times never gave any importance to the woman. And the word the woman itself signifies the importance of their rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put. And not only rights, I always say that Islam gives heights to the woman, and that's the honor that Allah has provided them.
And just to finish that, I think I remember an old tweet from you. It elevated them to the pinnacle of success.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
So yeah, just to touch upon that, Islamic laws liberated and gave women rights during the days of ignorance. This was a time where women did not inherit any wealth at all, no property, nothing of that nature. This, these verses that were passed were to actually give women rights in Islam to take from the estate of their husband who passed away, and add on to bring them, basically give them inheritance as well. Now, the question that comes up, and why I wrote controversial alert, is why do women inherit less? Typically speaking, and traditionally speaking, Islamically as well, this is a time for, when the husband passes away, it's the responsibility of the sons to take care of the mother. Or if the mother remarries, it's the responsibility of the husband to take care of the person who was a widow. And again, Islamically speaking, the wife's property belongs to her alone, while husband's property is communal, meaning that it's shared by both. So challenges plus planning according to Islamic law. Obviously, in the current century that we're living in, we have certain concerns. Maybe I want my wife to have XYZ. Maybe I want my daughter to have, this or that. And there's definitely room for this. Remember that a will or an Islamic will only comes into play after a person passes away. Some ways to increase, the inheritance. Well, I shouldn't even say inheritance, but the wealth of your daughters or your spouse while they're alive is to maybe increase the dowry amount which you use when you get married. Basically, that's a debt against the husband that has to be paid at a time the husband passes away. Giving less or no wasiyah to increase inheritance, and this is something that we will touch on in the upcoming slide. And transferring property inter vivos. So one time I had an individual, he wanted an Islamic will, but he was not okay with the fact that his daughter was going to get, 1/2 less than what the son would get. So basically what he could do is, while he's still alive, he could give her X amount of cash. He could give her X amount of property, X amount of jewelry, to kind of make up for that how he seems fit. So inter vivos basically means giving gifts while you're still alive, which is something you're allowed to do, and you could plan accordingly and still have an Islamic will, when you pass away.
So I'll quickly take that, Brother Zohaib. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine.
You can take a water break, man. I know you're So with regards to virtue and, of course, the harms of not having the will, hadith of Rasulullah ﷺ reported in Sahih al-Bukhari that it is a duty of a Muslim who has anything to bequest not to leave or let 2 nights pass without writing a will about it. I remember when we were students, I still remember our class when we were learning about miras and inheritance. There's a kitab called Siraji, which teaches you the calculations of how to, distribute wealth. So you actually you do it once, but I had to do it twice because of course you have to redo it. And I remember we were sitting there, and as students at that time, you really didn't have any money or any cash. The only thing was whatever your parents supported you while you were studying. So I remember our teachers telling us to write wills. wasiyat. And we said, Ustadi, we have nothing. He said, even your kitabs, even your books, because you should know that you're not here forever. This reminds you that the wealth that you have is very temporary. A man said, Ya Rasulullah, I don't feel like dying. I don't feel like akhirah. I don't feel that feeling. Rasulullah says the heart of a person is where the mal of the person is, the wealth of the person is. That's what the Nabi of Allah said. And of course, the second hadith, which is reported by Ibn Majah, Ahmad and Ibn Majah, where a man may do good deeds for 70 years. But if he actually unjustly, when he leaves his last testament, meaning when he's leaving the money itself, the wickedness of his deed will be sealed upon him and he will enter the fire. And if on the other hand, a man acts wickedly for 70 years, but is just in his last will, and of course the wasiyah, the goodness of his deed will be sealed upon him and he will enter garden. That doesn't mean that we take away the haqq of people in life. That doesn't mean that we can cheat people, deceive people, and have a good will and die and go to Jannah. No. It means that, even during our lifetime and even in our ending, we make sure that our mal and our actions are dealt with justice, with adl, and that is the root of our deen and religion.
Definitely. That just brings to mind, sometimes I get phone calls and individuals are like, why do I need to make a will? I don't have much. And most of these conversations always go like this. I was like, do you own a property? Yes. Do you have a car? Yes. Do you have cash? Yes. And a lot of people sometimes, think that that's nothing, right? It's something at the end of the day, and you should have one. Then sometimes people are like, I have no property, not much cash, no cars or anything like that. And sometimes you're not making a will for what you have now. You're making a will for what you have until the time you pass away. And it might be different this year, but the next year it can change. And the year after that, it could be substantially more. So, that's something that we'll touch on a little bit later. And then if you completely feel like you don't have anything at all, also your intention is something. You're leaving this world with the intention that if you were to acquire something by the time you pass away, you would even want that dollar distributed according to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So New York State will requirements. Obviously, we're living in New York State. New York State law controls, and we have to abide by that. So we have to make it compatible, and we're here to find out what are New York State will requirements as well, and if it's compatible with Islamic inheritance law or not. So to run through these quickly, you have to be over the age of 18. You have to be somebody of sound mind and capacitated, be able to make decisions for yourself. You have to sign the document. You have to have 2 disinterested witnesses. The witnesses cannot be individuals who are a beneficiary on the will. It has to be somebody completely disinterested, such as a friend, neighbor, things of that nature, a colleague at work, just someone completely random, to put in very simple terms.
Does not have to be a Muslim. It could be any individual.
Any individual, individual, yes. List of beneficiaries. So you should list who is the beneficiary of your will. It has to be in writing. And you should, this is optional, but you really don't make a will in New York State without it. You should have a self-proving affidavit. Basically, in short, it's a self-proving affidavit. It is a notary notarizing that they saw the 2 witnesses see the testator sign the will. So basically, if there were to be any discrepancies about the testator signing the will, you have the 2 witnesses, and then you have the notarization as well of the notary stating that he saw the 2 witnesses witness signing of the will.
Do the beneficiaries have to be there or no?
They should be there by name. Yeah, by name.
But do they have to be physically present there or not?
No.
Okay, so if when the will is being written, so you have the person who is getting their will written, 2 witnesses, the person who's going to notarize, and the person who's writing the will.
Just to make it more simple, you have the person signing the will, you have 2 witnesses, and usually the person who wrote the will and is the notary is going to be the attorney.
Got it.
Yeah. So if typically you have at least 4 people in the room. If you don't have 4 people in the room, there's something wrong. But one thing is post-COVID, there's virtual notary. So it's changed up the process a little bit. You technically don't need everyone in the same room, but
Got
a
it.
little bit more complicated. We're going to keep it simple. Now, what if I die without a will? An administrator is appointed, meaning that the court decides who administers your estate. There may be a bond that the administrator has to issue to distribute your assets. You're not able to appoint a guardian for your minor children because you don't have a will. And most importantly, your assets or your estate will be distributed according to what New York state law says and not Islamic law. Now, what are New York state intestacy laws? And what I'm referring to right now is what happens if you pass away without an Islamic will, or any will at all for that matter. The spouse receives everything if there's no children. Now if there are children, the spouse receives 50,000 plus half of the residual estate if there are children. So to basically make it simple, let's say that you leave behind 100,000. The spouse would get 75,000, and the 25,000 remaining will be divided equally amongst the remaining children. This is according to New York state laws.
Could you repeat that again with the $100,000 scenario?
Sure. So if you leave behind the $100,000 and there's no will in place, the spouse will receive the first 50 plus half of the remaining, meaning that she would take 75,000. And the remaining half, which is the remaining quarter, I should say, 25,000 would be distributed amongst the children.
No matter how many they are.
Correct.
Okay.
All right. Children receive all if there's no spouse. And in New York state laws, the parents are disinherited, meaning the parents do not inherit at all. All are contrary to Islamic distributions. So to avoid this, please make an Islamic will. It's only similar in the sense that the debts have to be paid prior to anybody else inheriting as well. So now the big question, and I think we touched on this in the beginning, and this slide will expand on it. What makes a will Islamic? Is it a halal sticker? Do I take a will and write halal will on top and have a client sign it? Definitely not. That's not what makes it halal. The premise here is that we are not the owners of our wealth. It is Allah's wealth, and we are just trustees of it. So one has to have that basic understanding when inquiring or looking or intending to make an Islamic will. And why are we doing it? Because we're following the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are told how to earn our wealth, spend it, and the most forgotten, how to distribute it upon passing. Mufti Farhan, would you like to add anything on that?
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay. All right.
Oh, you gotta take a water break.
Yeah. I'm okay. I think you're used to talking. MashaAllah, you've been doing great webinars. I'm still getting used to it. But we'll continue. Importance of an Islamic will. So we don't want an autopsy, right? But if law requires it, it's something we have to do. Guardianship for children. We get to appoint guardians should we pass away where our children are minors. Funeral and burial right. Some people don't like discussing this in a will, but it's something that we can have of how we would like to pass away, because obviously an Islamic burial is very, very simple compared to other faiths and other traditions, and this is something we may want to emphasize in our will, especially if we have non-Muslim family. Paying outstanding debts. This is something that needs to be taken care of prior to anybody else inheriting. Now, the wasiya aspect of it. So the wasiya aspect of it is 1/3. A max 1/3 you can give to charity or other qualified individuals in your will, not more than that. And this is an optional part of making an Islamic will.
And I'm sorry to cut you off. And with that wasiya, that 1/3 can be given to only those who are not beneficiaries of direct inheritance.
Correct. From an Islamic perspective, correct. Because if it were to grant it to beneficiaries, it would increase their share, which would go against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained for us.
Understood. And then, as you had mentioned previously in the beginning, is that if there's a parent who want their daughters or someone else or one child to have more, rather than using the clause of 1/3 wasiya, in their lifetime, they should give a portion of their wealth in their ownership as their children, so that they can have more before they pass away. Because once a person passes away, then the laws of inheritance or wasiyat and miras will actually kick in, right?
Correct. And also on the flip side of that is that if you are concerned about how much, if your children are not inheriting enough or your spouse is not inheriting enough, you could forego the wasiya aspect, and that would increase the Sharia distributions because you are giving less.
Brother Zohaib, but I'm sorry to cut you off. And I really hope that inshallah, maybe we'll have a second session that I want to talk to you about trusts, how to create that whole trust and responsibility over trusts, because that's a whole topic to itself. A lot of time people want to put their money or their wealth in the trusts, and they want to, and alhamdulillah, I know that you had some really amazing brothers and sisters involved in that work who will be able to join us for that as well. So we can touch upon that exclusively in a separate session of how you can keep a trust and then be able to distribute accordingly through that as well.
Definitely. And what I like to say is the topic we're discussing right now is basically an ocean. There's so many different areas in this, and we're just basically doing a drop in the bucket today. And there's a lot more to add on to this, and we will make a continuous series, I think, to cover more situations as well. Funeral expenses should be reasonable, and expenses are to be paid by the estate. If somebody fronts the money for the burial, this is something that they can, take in once the estate is distributed.
But if a child or any individual wants to do it as something for their parents, their loved ones, their spouses,
Correct.
It would be acceptable Islamically, but if possible, if wanted, the money can be taken away or deducted from the entire estate.
Correct, yes. Somebody asked the question, I'm just gonna quickly answer, not to go off topic, but it's a good question. And don't quote me, but I'm almost positive I'm correct. Somebody asked, what if I would want to make my will applicable and the country that they gave is Pakistan? I'm assuming they may have assets there or property or things of that nature. I've never fully seen this through, but from what I've been told from others, is that you obviously the will that you make here is applicable anywhere, because there's a clause in there saying that your property anywhere, right, is controlled by this will. But to make it specifically applicable in a certain country, from what I've looked into and I've been told, is that there's an option to go to the local consulate. And in this case, it would be the Pakistani consulate, referring to the question that was asked. And you could have it notarized there, and they would keep something on file for it to be used should you pass away in that country. That's something I could look further into, but I'm almost positive I'm correct in that respect. And I just thought it was an interesting question that deserves some attention.
Yeah, there are some questions, but we can touch them near the end, inshallah.
Yeah, and I think we still have a long way to go.
I know.
So that's Islamic perspective. Loans, dowry, this is something that has to be paid. Debts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what you could make and add into your wasiya, which is the 1/3 aspect of it. So interesting fact, John Harvard, who is he? What did he do? The last name, everyone makes them intrigued. John Harvard was an individual who changed the name of, I believe it's called New College. What was New College? New College is Harvard College right now. So John Harvard had given away half of his wealth to New College, and they changed the name to his last name. Why am I bringing this up? Because too often I see in our communities that the applicable 1/3 wasiya aspect of it, we never leave towards a charity or a masajid or a non-for-profit that is doing good work. Or for lack thereof, we don't leave a will at all to begin with, right? Within our communities. And we need to utilize that 1/3 option to give back where we can. First and foremost, it's a jariyah for us when we pass away. But also we are building a legacy and how other communities and religious institutions and colleges have thrived off of endowment, inheritance money, estates, things of that nature. We need to kind of dig in there as well. And as Muslims, this is something that we need to structure our will and our estate planning as well to kind of give back to our community so they can thrive as well.
Just one point. I was in Haram a few years ago and I saw a big poster and it said the Waqf of Uthman ibn Affan, the endowment of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. So Uthman radiallahu anhu, amongst the most generous individuals amongst the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, his endowment Waqf still continues to feed people in Mecca at this moment. His Waqf that he started that time, that Sadaqah Jariyah continuous, still has an account in that location with the endowment of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu.
Subhanallah. So, these are how and it happened so early in our Islamic tradition, right? And, fast forward, it's something that we forget that we need to utilize more in our part. Also, wasiya, there's no restrictions on distributions. You can give to non-Muslims or you can even give to adopted children. There's a famous hadith of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas regarding max giving 1/3 of the estate. I'll let Mufti Farhan speak briefly on that.
So I'm just going to skip on that, but I was just going to share a quick point on this, Brother Zohaib, and I was going to say that, look, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed for many people with wealth, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has even blessed their awlad and their children. And I'm pretty sure, inshallah, the children will do something good for parents, but sometimes it scares me that they may not be. They may become so busy in their own things. So do something good for your own self. I'm not saying leave your children behind in poverty, but having that 1/3 choice of your wealth, doing something for the sake of Allah. Alhamdulillah, for many, their children are doing amazing. They're well settled, mashallah, they're professionals, they're earning well. They may not even need the wealth of the parents. It's just going to be an addition. But for you to be able to have your 1/3 for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a sadaqah jariyah, Brother Zohaib, in the past 1 year, I have been to the graveyard more than ever. And one of the biggest questions that I hear from family members after they bury their loved one is, what can we do for this individual now? And I always wish that, gosh, I hope that this person had done something as a continuous charity for their own self before they left this world. So I think it's a great opportunity for all of us. Doesn't have to be large amounts, even small, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases with intention.
Definitely. And as we mentioned earlier, the wasiya is not mandatory to leave, it's optional. But I think Mufti Farhan very eloquently highlighted of why it should be left behind. And we touched on this, but it cannot name beneficiary or heirs to increase their share. Meaning that if your son will be a beneficiary in Islamic will, you cannot give him your 1/3 wasiya portion of it as well, because it would unfairly increase his share. And you could also use the wasiya aspect, for fidya, kafara, hajj, things of that nature. Mufti Farhan, we're just a little limited on time, but if you want to expand on that.
Sure. For example, upon a person, hajj was mandatory. The person had health, the person had wealth, but they were not able to perform hajj. So this individual said, you know what, if I die, please do hajj on my behalf from the wealth that I'm leaving behind. So that's known as a debt to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person may have said that, you know what, I missed these many months of fasting and these many months of prayers because I was sick, or I did not know, or I was just lazy. Please make the kafara or fidya on my behalf from the wealth that I have. So that is something that has to be paid as debts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such as fidya, kafara, and hajj itself.
Yep. And fun fact, so we'll get into this, but there was a Muslim Arab mathematician named Mohammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, and he wrote a very famous textbook. And from that textbook, algebra was invented. And from that, we have fractions, which is something that we will speak in detail about. So I just want to kind of throw a fun fact into there. Now, who inherits? Marriage or blood? Yes. Step or adopted children? No. Killing the decedent? No. So if you were killed by one of your beneficiaries or your heirs, Islamically speaking, they cannot inherit. Somebody who changed religions? No. Only Muslims would be able to inherit under the will. Widow remarries, yes. Disobedient children, as much as sometimes, and I've dealt with these family situations where they don't want to leave the child behind anything. But
Just came. But Usman Ahmed says, am I allowed to exclude one kid from my will? Just kidding. No.
No. Infants, yes. And where's the evidence of this derived from? And I'll let Mufti Farhan opine on that.
So the hadith of Al-Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that the Muslim does not inherit from the unbeliever, nor does the unbeliever inherit from the Muslim. But as Brother Zohaib mentioned previously from the previous few slides, that when it comes to the 1/3, that can be given to someone who may not be a Muslim, but might have been very close to you. They had helped you a lot. So that 1/3 portion has no restrictions of faith, religion, or anything, and it could benefit any individual. So if someone has someone very close to them or someone who has helped them, and they want to make sure that they could help them in some way before, after they pass away, that 1/3 portion can allow them. But when it comes to inheritance, the direct inheritance or estate that has to be distributed amongst the beneficiaries, it has to be only to the people of belief itself. And of course, a person who murder does not inherit.
Correct. Possible male inheritors. I'm not going to run through this whole list, but this is just to give you an idea of who possibly can inherit from male inheritors. And this is a full-fledged list of those individuals. Possible female inheritors. Who are individuals that are female that can inherit? And this is a list of that. But the key thing from that to remember, I know you saw a lot of names, and you're like, wait, is my uncle getting something? Is my Halal or Papa getting something? The answer to that is probably not. It depends on who survives you. Meaning, when you pass away, who do you leave in this world? And that's the important question to ask.
There's no generic one solution for any individual. It all differs upon individual conditions, individual circumstances.
Correct. And this is why when you do an Islamic will, sometimes the best way to do it is to add in a table of a number of different scenarios, because you don't know what scenario you're going to leave when you leave this world. And that kind of encompasses everything. But again, something we will talk about. So I made this little diagram to kind of put into perspective two different scenarios. And I always think it's good to make diagrams because it's probably a lot easier to understand. So what if I don't have an Islamic will? Or what if I do? Because one of the scenarios addresses that. So let's say Eunice passes away, and we're going towards my left, but it maybe you're towards your right, depending on how it's flipped on the screen. Has a legally Islamic will, has a legally valid Islamic will. It goes through a process known as probate, and this is a court-administered process where basically, the surrogate's court determines is the will valid, right? And who should the executor be? Who distributes the estate? Everything looks good, things of that nature. And after that, the administrator, I should say the executor in this case, just distributes the assets according to the Sharia principles outlined in the will. So let's go to the second scenario. Eunice passes away, doesn't have a legally valid Islamic will. He dies something called intestate, meaning that he passed away without a will and New York State laws control. They go through the court process. New York State laws of intestacy controls, meaning New York State decides how your estate should be distributed. I just want to pause there. A lot of times people have this misconception, you pass away without a will, the state will take everything. That's not true at all. It would have to be a severe case where you left behind no relatives at all for the state to take that in, and that's something that just doesn't happen. Legal consequences of that are it's at odds with Sharia, right? It's contrary to what Sharia law says or what Sharia law tells you how to distribute. But meanwhile, the heirs, which are the beneficiaries of that, can choose how to redistribute your assets or your estates according to Sharia principles. That may sound like it's something feasible, but unfortunately, sometimes you come across situations when a person passes away and there's wealth, there's property. Sometimes that gets the best of us, right? And you don't want family to make decisions or engage in conflict when you could have done that while you were alive to make those decisions. And probably, I don't, I mean to be very, I'm being very frank, it almost never happens that they choose to distribute it according to Sharia principles, right? Because who's going to want to say, give me less money? There's individuals that have that iman, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevate them and reward them, but it's very unlikely to come across, especially when you're dealing with large sums of money. So don't leave that to your family to decide. Take care of that before it's our time to go. Algebra, fractions. So I went to law school, so I did not have to deal with math whatsoever and have to deal with fractions. But last year when I was studying the Islamic perspective of wills, this is something I had to learn, and I was like, wait, hold on. So I had to find a way to make it easier for myself to understand as well. So this way it would be easier for the audience to learn as well. So instead of using different fractions, I kind of broke it down into percentages. Sometimes you couldn't get to a full 100, so the percentages might be off by 1 or 2%. So just don't take it for the actual value, but more so to understand what the division would look like, all right? So let's talk about the first example. Muhammad dies intestate, meaning that he passed away without a valid will, whether it was Islamic or according to his own wishes. And he passed away. He's survived by his wife, Amina, one son, Waqas, one daughter, Farhan. Muhammad had an estate of 240,000 with no outstanding debts. So again, just to emphasize, this individual passed away without a will, but New York state law controls. So because New York state law controls, and read the header, if you guys could take a look at the header on each one of them, it'll clearly outline what type of scenario we're discussing. Died in New York without a will, example 1. If Muhammad died in New York, for example, then the above distribution would be dramatically different under the state's intestacy laws, whereby Amina would be entitled to 50,000 plus 1/2 of the remainder, for a total of 145,000. And Waqas and Fariel would equally share the remainder, getting $47,500 each. And this is if a individual were to pass away without a will. Now, let's say that he passed away with a will, right? Under Sharia inheritance law, without the 1/3 wasiya option, Amina is entitled to 1/8. Approximately $30,000, and Waqas and Fariel share the remaining 210,000. Since Muhammad is the male, he receives a share twice that of Fariel. So Muhammad is entitled to 140,000, translating to 2/3, and the daughter is entitled to 70,000, which would be 1/3. So now this is another example under Sharia inheritance with the 1/3 wasiya option, which we said is optional.
Zohaib, may I request you to just click the hide button on that screen? It says hide.
I see it, yes.
Jazak. Oh, perfect. Thank you.
So this is under Sharia inheritance law with the 1/3 wasiya option. So you see this is dramatically different as well, right? So 33%, let's say, would go to an organization of your choosing, or it could be an individual of your choosing. Maybe you really liked XYZ person, he was good to you all your life, non-Muslim, and you would like to distribute the wealth to him or her. That's an option, right? Then we have Muhammad adds. If Muhammad adds the 1/3 option of wasiya, his estate of 240 will be distributed as follows. The wasiya aspect would take about 79,000. Amina, his wife, would take about 19,000. Fariel, the daughter, would take about 48,000. And Waqas, the son, would take twice that at 96,000. And those are the percentages that are broken up to give you an idea.
So I know, Zohaib, we have a few of the examples, and I know every single individual example with people will dramatically change, right?
Correct. The whole key is who do you leave behind, right? And that's the key thing to know. And we'll just run through a couple of examples. Now, husband, son, and daughter, Islamic distributions. Wife is survived by her husband. So now it's the wife who passed away, and they leave behind a husband, son, and daughter. Son gets approximately 50%. Daughter and husband take 25%. Now, the husband is survived by the wife, daughter, son 1, and son 2, meaning the husband passed away and he leaves a wife, daughter, son 1, and son 2, meaning 2 sons. And that's the distribution there, that the 2 sons get the bulk of it, daughter get about 18%, and the wife gets about 12%.
If I may request, can we just jump to the estate of the deceased? I think the examples we might put people off a little at this time. What do you think?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So that was just an idea to give you how the estate is distributed Islamically. And sometimes when you engage and talk about Islamic inheritance, you'll hear fractions such as 2/3, 1/3, 1/8, 7/24. What does that mean? It's basically the percentage of the estate that they take in. So now the estate of the deceased. Everyone thinks that estate means like a castle, or it's like a mansion or something to that effect. No, you have an estate. I have an estate. Mufti Farhan has an estate. Everyone has an estate. It could be your clothes, cars, cash, books, jewelries. Debts other individuals own you. Let's say I gave somebody a loan while I was alive. That's my estate, the money that he owes me back in return. Business, furnitures. So it's not some home in Beverly Hills or some castle, or it's anything that the individual owns is considered his estate. Distribution. You want to distribute quickly. You must have consent of all inheritors to give to charity if that's something that you choose to do on your own, and the money becomes the heirs.
Is that right? And this refers to the portion of the beneficiaries portion. It does not refer to the wasiya 1/3, right? So if 1/3 of the wasiya was for charity, the inheritors don't have to agree upon that. Is that correct? And this is for their portion.
Correct. To go back to what you were saying earlier, sometimes you have children that are very well settled, right? Financially, they're stable. So, this is a way for their parents or their loved ones to earn sadaqah jariyah, that I'm okay right now. I do not need this inheritance. Let me give it for a charitable cause in the name of my mother or father.
Or even sometimes I've seen that once the distributions have been completed, everyone agrees to give it to maybe one of the siblings who is not well-to-do, and they say, you know what, give my portion. This is my portion, but that brother or sister could actually have that.
Definitely. It's just something that has to be agreed amongst the siblings.
Correct.
Now, what's covered in a will? I saw a question about this. So assets, I'm sorry, I keep using assets. Estate, probate estate. So what's covered in a will? Property owned individually. So property owned just under one person's name. Personal assets, cars, jewelry, safety deposit box, money, watches, things of that nature, okay? Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, right? And another topic to itself.
This is not a fatwa.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I'm okay.
Depending on what you own, it's stocks, your Robinhood account, right? Your TD Ameritrade account, things of that nature under your personal name, right? Your cars, individually owned bank accounts, all right? So if I have a bank account under my name, that's something covered under will. Non-probate estate, not controlled by a will. Joint property. So this is a long discussion, and it's something I need some more clarity on myself from Islamic perspective. And again, this is a very detailed topic. Most deeds now are recorded. It'll say, the husband's names, wife's names, comma, and recorded either something to the effect of a husband and wife, or my husband, or recorded as joint tenants with the rights of survivorship. So basically that recording on the deed, what it shows is that when one person passes away, property automatically transfers to the other person, okay? So that's something that a will does not control. Joint bank accounts. So let's say husband and wife have a bank account, right, together. That's something that a will does not control. If you happen to have a life insurance policy, IRAs, 401ks, pension plans, those all typically have beneficiaries listed on there. And that's something that a will does not control. It goes directly to beneficiary. This is a very long conversation to have of how to structure it. I'm sorry. Yeah. Islamic. Yeah. Sharia according to Sharia, distribution according to Sharia terms. So you want to make sure when you make a will, you can't write my estate will be distributed by Mufti Imam so-and-so, right? That's just not applicable. To make it simple, name of heirs, distributions, or you risk objections or the will becoming invalid, right? Stating that I would like my assets distributing according to Sharia principles, right? Maybe somewhat subjective, right? Because as things progress, you don't know what people's interpretations of that will be. So it's better that you list it as opposed to somebody else deciding. And courts want absolutely nothing to do with the religion. Not in a negative sense, but they don't want to interfere with one's religion by a court deciding what Islamic principles are. So it's better you clarify X, Y, and Z for them, as opposed to them saying it's invalid because they don't want to step in the toes or on the toes of anyone dealing with religion. Modifications. Review will whenever a family changes, newborn, death, divorce. This is something you should make changes to a will. And a codicil is basically an amendment to a will. It's not something people do anymore. They just end up making a brand new will. And if you go back to the attorney that you went to, it would be sometimes as simple as just making changes to a Word document. So in short, Sharia versus New York state law, is it compatible? Yes, definitely. Potential conflicts is that according to New York state law, a spouse is set to inherit 1/3 of the estate, or 50,000, or it could be 75,000, whichever one is greater. Even if your will says your spouse will only take 1/8, they can still protest after the individual passes away to get a higher share because New York state law grants them that. Typically speaking, there's an understanding between the spouses that this will not be done at the time of passing by either spouse because they're observing, what Islamic principles are. But if for some case, if this is the question either spouse has, you can make them sign a waiver for their spousal right of election that they can't exercise that when either spouse passes away. And also non-Muslim inheritance. So let's say you have a son who's not Muslim anymore. Technically, according to your Islamic will, he cannot inherit. Is this valid? It's something I guess maybe that will play out in the court system to see if it is or not. But I've read some old case law in different states where individuals that were practicing the Jewish religion had some clauses in there pertaining to their religious beliefs and what they want their children to exercise, and they were not held invalid. Process for drafting a will: gather infos about assets, liabilities, gather info about family, think about debts owed to people and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wasiya, am I leaving it? Am I not leaving it? Discuss with family, and do not leave it in a safety deposit box because you will make it much difficult for your family to get to. Have it in an area where your loved ones are aware where it is. Businesses, figure out who owns the business, who doesn't own the business. A lot of times, X person's running the business, but Y's person's names are on the books, right? And this can be a major, major conflict should one person passes away and their family is looking for some type of financial or inheritance gain, I guess I should say. So fix that, please, because it's good to have your paperwork in order. Benefits of a last will and testament. Pros are you can name guardians for minor children. You could name an executor to manage your estate. And you could dictate who gets separate probate assets, right? The cons are it still has to go through a court-ordered process. It does not control joint property or joint bank accounts, and there's not much tax planning behind it. And I think this is the second to last slide. Trust versus will. I guess that will be answered in part 2, but I'll just give you a short example of what a will is and what a trust is in respect to one another. Let's say I leave behind a bank account with just my name on it. That's the only thing I leave behind. I have to, or my family or loved ones have to go through a process known as probate to gain access to that bank account. Post-COVID, it took people 4 or 5 months just to get some documents to show to the bank to gain access, right? Whole process can take up to a year. If I have a trust and my bank account is titled to the name of the trust, there's no court process that I have to go through. And I could just walk in, show them this is the trust, I'm the trustee, and I'm distributing these assets according to what the trust says. Obviously, it's a lot more expensive, time consuming, and inshallah, we will touch on that in part 2. As a reminder for everyone, this is not legal advice, does not constitute any attorney-client privilege. It's only for educational and informational purposes only. If you would like to contact Mufti Farhan or myself, that's my email address, that's Mufti Farhan's email address, and we will try to help in any way possible.
I want to go quickly to some of the questions. I know we're already kind of very late, but let's run some of the questions if you can. Is that okay, Brother Zohaib?
Yeah. If I can answer, I will be more than willing to
answer them. If we don't, we'll cover next week. Next time. Brother Farhan Ahmed says, does the Islamic will that's made in New York valid in other states?
If you move to a different state, you should have a will for that state.
Okay. You have to get it redone, or the same one can be?
No, you would make one in that state.
Okay.
Because at that time, you would have property, you would have bank accounts in that state, and it would just be very, very wise for you to do.
Okay. For example, for a person, if their properties have not changed, if their bank's account have not changed, but they just have changed their locations or their addresses, can they just move, or every state differs?
Every state differs in their execution requirements, but you may make it difficult for you to gain access to that property because you're residing in one state and you have to go again. Probate is another topic we'll cover in part 2. It's very detailed, and inshallah in that we'll cover what you should do if you have property in different states and you're residing in a different state. It's more complex, that's why.
Got it. Sister Zohra asks, Assalamu alaikum, aren't parents inheritors too? Yes, they
Islamically speaking, yes, they are. But if you pass away without an Islamic will and New York state laws control, they are not.
Jazakallah. But Usman Ahmed says, can I turn my whole wealth to my wife in my life? I hope you're typing it and she is not. But
I don't know which one is looking for validation. Maybe he's looking for me to say no. No, I'm only kidding. Yes, that would be referred to as transferring property inter vivos, and it's definitely a possibility. I had somebody just last week, they did a deed transfer. Their house was paid off, mashallah, everything was done, and they gave their entire home to the name of their wife while they were still alive, and that's something that you could definitely do.
Can the executor make the decision to give 1/3 to charity, or does it have to be written in the will? I guess it will depend, right? Wasiyat or portions. I think you touched upon that.
The executor has some discretion, a lot of power, but they have to abide by what the will says. So if you do not leave 1/3 to charity, an executor can't just get up and be like, hey, you know, he was a nice guy, I want him to get Sadaqah Jariyah, nice brother or sister, I want him or her to get Sadaqah Jariyah, and I'm going to give 1/3 of his wealth away. It doesn't work like that. He's only there to execute your decisions according to your will.
Does New York state law allows Islamic wills to be executed easily?
Correct. It's very similar. It's almost identical to executing a regular will. The only thing is that the distributions have changed. Typically speaking, people leave everything to their spouse, and if their spouse is not there, equally amongst their children. But Islamically speaking, from what we touched on, those distributions are different.
Islamically, if someone has 2 sons, 2 daughters in the Islamic will, who is supposed to execute the will after the person passes away?
So Islamically speaking, Islam doesn't dictate who your executor should be. It could be anyone. It could be your friend. It could be your neighbor. It could be your spouse. It could be your son, your daughter. It doesn't matter. The only thing is that the executor has to be distributed according to what the Islamic will says.
Someone asked for your number. We'll have your email address at the end, inshallah. We'll share that.
Yeah. screenshot of my email address, and you can put me an email, and inshallah, I'll reply with my phone number.
Someone asked me, Mufti Farhan, are we Islamically allowed to say you can pull my plug? It all depends upon conditions. It depends upon the state of the individual. What state that they have reached, vegetative state, what's the state of their mind, brain functionality. Of course, a person does have the choice to sign the DNI and DNR as an individual that I don't want any extra help. But when it comes to family members and people who are making that decision, they have to go through a multiple process to really see if it's the right time for them or not. Do you practice in Long Island? Someone asked.
Yes, it's just to answer that question more generally. Attorneys are licensed to practice in different states, not specific locations within that state. So somebody licensed to practice in New York, like myself, can practice anywhere in New York for that matter.
Jazakallah. So we do have some questions, but we're going to keep that for the next time because it's either trust, probate, and other things. So I'm going to keep those questions for next week. Brother Zohaib, thank you so much for joining us. It has been an amazing time that we had. Just to give a larger highlight of our session 2, what do we expect to cover, inshallah, in that? I know we want to cover probate, we want to cover trust, we want to cover a little bit about businesses as well.
Yeah. So inshallah, to be planned, and we'll have a flyer up soon with more information. But what we want to cover after this is that what is a trust, right? We spoke about wills. We want to speak about what a trust is and what are different types of trust and what's the benefit of a trust and what's the cost difference between the two, because it's drastic, right? But a trust will also save your family a lot of headache and court proceedings and time should you pass away. You have to figure out what makes financial sense for you and time-wise what makes sense for your family. Second thing that we will cover is if you pass away without a will or with a will, you have to go through something known as an administrative proceeding or probate proceeding. And this is where the court gets involved and what that looks like, how long it takes, and what paperwork you need and things of that nature. And inshallah, those are 2 topics that we look to cover in the coming weeks.
That is amazing. Thank you so much, Brother Zohaib. We have a lot, inshallah, that we will be covering next time, but may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you and bless you for your time and your efforts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all the brothers and sisters who have joined and benefited, inshallah. And again, please keep yourself and your families connected towards the masajid, the houses of Allah, as a means of protection for all of us. With this, Brother Zohaib, again, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And jazakallah. May Allah bless you, and we'll see you next time, brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.